A few seconds after the correction process started, a system notification appeared, informing him that the automatic correction was completed, and then a model of his newly created item of equipment appeared in front of Grid. Looking at the rarity and characteristics of the item and the materials used to create it, Grid happily said, "It's incredible. This is not a simple item. It even increases movement speed and wind resistance." Immediately after that, Grid happily added in his head, not knowing what disappointment awaited him in the near future, and the materials are quite simple, just 20 silphide scales. What a success! Looking at the model of the object he created, Grid happily said in his head, "Now let's give it a rather simple name, a hoodie with a zipper." Immediately after that, Grid immediately went to Khan to find out how he could get the materials he needed to create this cloak. After hearing the boy's question, Khan laughed out loud and said to hunt for sylphids. If you are not an elementalist, you will not even be able to see them. How are you going to catch them? Hearing that all his hopes had been dashed in an instant, Grid shouted angrily at Khan, "Stop mocking me! Why couldn't you have told me about this earlier?" The next moment, letting a river of tears flow from his eyes, Grid said in frustration in his head, "Shit, I'm in deep shit. I've come up with an item for which I can't get the materials myself." Seeing how disappointed Grid was to learn that he would not be able to see them, let alone catch them, Khan happily said, "Let me finish. There is a way to get the sulphide scales without seeing them." Hearing this, Grid exclaimed in surprise, "You just said that, but tell me." The next moment, Khan smiled slyly and said to his student, "You just need to hunt the frost orcs, the Kori, who live in the mountains to the north, and they have a sixth sense skill that helps them spot and hunt silphide, and they keep the scales." Imagining in his mind the same monsters that live in the frosty mountains of the north, Khan confidently added that even though they are too weak and sensitive to fire, they are still stronger, bigger, and smarter than ordinary orcs. Hearing this advice about how to get materials from the sulphide fairies, Grid said in surprise, "Ah yes, there is still a way to get them," and then added in his head, "Orcs are one of the weakest creatures. As long as I can resist the cold, I will not have much trouble defeating them." Immediately after that, the boy smiled in anticipation and said in his head, "I need to prepare special equipment," and then said to the blacksmith, "I need production methods for cold-resistant armor." Hearing Grid's request for production methods for the armor, Khan thought for a moment and then said, "So, cold resistance. You should use the skin of a giant brown bear." Having received all the materials he needed to create the armor he needed, Grid confidently said in his head, "Since I now have an epic hammer, I can get at least rare equipment." Preparing to get the equipment of excellent quality, Grid confidently said in his head, "I'm just sure of my success," and then asked Khan if it was time to start. After some time, Grid completed the creation of the cold-proof equipment, but despite his efforts and updated forging tools, he turned out an item of ordinary rarity. Angry that he had failed again, Grid mentally said, "Oh, those damn moderators," and Khan, at that moment, walked over to the door and pointed his finger to the sky and said nervously, "Wow, look at that bird." Continuing to create the other items for the complete set, Grid said in his head, "Despite using the best materials and spending hours on it, the furnace turned out to be ordinary." While forging the rest of the items, the boy continued to think in his head, even using his epic hammer, wondering if I was the true embodiment of the ordinary or how it was possible. Resigned to the fact that nothing can be changed, the boy said in his head, "Okay, nothing can be done here. You need to concentrate on other subjects. This will definitely not happen again." Looking at how hard Grid was working on creating other items of equipment for the complete set, Khan, who was standing nearby, smiled happily and said, "Let's do it." After some time, Grid finally completed the complete set of cold-proof equipment. Standing in front of the forge, Khan said to Grid, "Well, the day of the hunt has finally arrived. I'll say it again, but the frost orcs are incredibly strong, so be careful." Emphasizing once again the danger that awaited him in this journey and hunt, the blacksmith added, "Your training was only the beginning, by the way. How do you like the new equipment?" At the time Grid was fully dressed in his own equipment, he had two common items, a breastplate and a hat, rare gloves and shoes that he had managed to forge of epic quality. Thinking about the answer to Khan's question, Grid mentally said one rare item and one epic item and then replied, "Well, it's not that bad, my equipment." Immediately after that, recalling the negative effects that were imposed on him by the system for inadequate equipment requirements, Grid mentally said that the fines were quite unpleasant. Also, after fully collecting the set of items, Grid received a system notification that said, "You have put on the Giant Brown Bear Protection Plus Cold Protection Plus set." Seeing such a nice bonus after collecting a full set of things, Grid happily looked at him and asked, "Wow, did you teach me the manufacturing method of the kit or what?" To which Khan replied, "Not really." Immediately after that, Khan smiled happily and said, "I create individual items when I work on us, and it just so happens that you managed to choose the perfect proportions." Looking at his equipment, Grid mentally said, "I just followed the production method step by step. Maybe it's because I'm a descendant of Pagma that complete items can be sold for a high enough price." Immediately after these thoughts, reaching for the weapon he had created in the competition against Ephemera, Grid said in his head, "Yes, and my weapon will be the perfect dagger. My training is perfect. Weak monsters like orcs will be easily destroyed." Getting ready to go hunting, Grid confidently said to his production partner and also his mentor, "Old man, I leave the forge to you." Turning his back on the blacksmith, Grid, who was leaving for the hunt, smiled happily and said, "Well, bye." It was his first hunt, and he was really quite well prepared. But there was something he didn't know, and that something was the probability of an item falling out of the winter orcs. The probability of dropping a sulfide scale from killing a monster was less than 1%. After some time, Grid finally arrived in the snowy plains of the north. Standing in front of the snow-covered location where the blizzard was taking place, the boy happily exclaimed "Boogaloo," but it was a bit chilly as expected from a set of giant armor. Looking at his self-made set of equipment, the boy happily said, "Most players will freeze here in a few minutes, but I'm fine thanks to my resistance to cold." After he finished boasting about how great his equipment was, Grid confidently said, "Now it's time to start hunting." Noticing a monster settlement not far from him, Grid said happily, "Here it is, the Frost Orc camp. I need the sulfide scales they have in their possession." Expecting that the battle against these enemies would be very easy, the boy said happily as he watched the camp. "These low-level monsters are so stupid that they can't even use a bow and arrow. Destroying them will be easier than taking candy from a child." A few minutes later, Grid confidently walked in front of the Frost Orc camp, expecting an easy item farm. Seeing the enemy in front of him, one of the orc guards said in surprise what was wrong with the man in the skin and why he suddenly came here. Looking at the enemy who suddenly appeared on their territory, one of the orcs asked him what was wrong with him, to which the other guard replied, "I don't know, but he's slowly approaching us." Eavesdropping on the conversation between the orc guards who were speaking in their own language, Grid happily said, "Boogaloo, I see you guys are communicating well. Uncivilized animals didn't even notice me." Continuing his open attack, the boy took out his weapon from the sheath and confidently said in his head, "I have the perfect weapon and armor." As he approached the enemies and pointed his weapon at them, the boy confidently exclaimed, "Give me the sulfide scales or you will meet your death here. You worthless orcs have realized." As soon as he said this, he noticed some movements on the wall around the camp, and an orc with a bow appeared right in front of him, pulling a bowstring, looking at him. The boy wondered in his head what an arrow was, why an orc was using a bow, and what was wrong with that accuracy. Immediately after these thoughts, Grid remembered the words of Khan who had warned him, saying that even if these orcs were weak against fire, they were still stronger, bigger, and smarter than ordinary orcs. Realizing that he had miscalculated somewhere and got into trouble, Grid, who had just had an arrow fly in front of his eyes, nervously said in his head, "Did I screw up again?" Immediately after that, the boy found no other solution but to use the fast movement skill, which increased dodging and agility for 1 minute. Dodging the arrows that were flying right in front of his nose, Grid nervously said in his head, "How can they be so accurate shooting at a distance of 10 meters in this wind? It seems their strength and skill is just terrible." After dodging a number of shots, Grid noticed that the arrows fired by the enemy were no longer flying at him. And then he wondered in his head if they had stopped, if they had run out of arrows. However, his guesses were in vain, as he looked up and saw a huge orc above him, preparing to strike a powerful blow with his two-handed axe. Having planned to finish everything quickly, and with one blow, the snow orc shouted something angrily in his language that meant "shut up and die brazenly." Dodging the enemy's attack, Grid, who was thrown back by the shockwave, nervously said in his head, "Up close, they are much bigger, you need to be more careful." Landing on his feet, the boy used his perfect dagger, using one of his skills, an air slash that deals % of the available attack power. Having made this strike, the boy smiled happily and said in his head, "This skill can harm even a knight in armor, so the orc must be very unhappy right now." Before he could rejoice too much, he saw a giant axe approaching him from the right side, which would surely take his head off if he did nothing. Unable to destroy Grid even after a sudden attack, the snow orc angrily looked at his opponent and said in an angry voice in his language that meant this scoundrel was quite painful. Having blocked the attack, the enemy Grid, who was pushed back, nervously said that this was not enough, but he was not even wearing armor. How strong was his skin? Looking at the enemy preparing to strike again, Grid said in frustration, "Oh man, why is this NPC so strong?" Blocking the enemy's attack with his dagger and body posture, he nervously said in his head, "Even if their strength is not much different from mine, it is impossible for me to kill them before dawn." Thinking about his next steps in this situation, Grid nervously said in his head, "I need to use a combination of skills." Holding the dagger in his hands, which he used to block the enemy's attack, Grid was able to find an opportunity and kick the enemy's body, thus causing damage. The next moment, he used the Blacksmith's Fury skill, which increased his attack power by the attack speed of the enemy, and prepared to deliver a powerful finishing blow. His next powerful attack was another aerial slash that went all the way around the orc's body. Finding the perfect moment to attack after catching the enemy off guard, Grid approached gleefully, saying in his head, "Thanks to the boost, my attack worked." He finally opened up. Poking his dagger directly into the enemy's chest, Grid confidently exclaimed in his head, "Goodbye." Then he even struck a critical blow. As a result of this attack, Grid received a system notification that said, "You dealt 1 unit of damage due to the accuracy of the target and the bleeding effect." Looking at the enemy to whom he had inflicted critical damage, Grid thoughtfully said, "I killed him." But unfortunately, the guy was wrong. Because of his carelessness and recklessness, the enemy came to his senses and immediately attacked Grid. Grasping his wounded shoulder, Grid saw a system notification that said, "You took damage points." Then he nervously said that he was fine, how he managed to survive. After these words, the boy got to his feet and headed for the enemy. And seeing the orc's condition, Grid confidently said in his head, "No, my attack worked, but he has too many health points." Starting a confrontation with the enemy, Grid missed 2 more attacks and received points of damage, respectively, trying to prevent fatal damage. The boy groaned in pain and exclaimed, "That hurt, you stupid orc." Realizing that he would not be able to continue like this, Grid said in his head that he needed to use a potion, after which he drank a medium recovery potion that added health points to his body. Continuing to exchange blows with the enemy, dealing and taking damage, Grid said in his head, "This will now simply become a battle of attrition." After receiving a certain total amount of damage, Grid immediately drank a regeneration potion to restore his life reserves. Thus, the battle continued for a certain period of time, with both fighters rapidly losing their health. Suddenly, Grid saw a system notification in front of him that said the health level was less than the potion recharge time of seconds. Finding himself in a disadvantageous situation trapped under a tree, Grid saw his enemy swinging his axe again to finish him off. Realizing that the situation was quite bad and he had no options to act in this situation, Grid nervously said, "Oh shit, this is bad timing. I'm in trouble." However, at one point, Grid noticed a system notification in front of him that said the passive effect of the title Apostle of Justice had been activated. The next moment, another system notification appeared, saying that the Apostle of Justice shows courage and strength when in danger, and that an Apostle of Justice is harder to kill until his opponent is dead. Seeing that his new title was suddenly activated, Grid said in surprise in his head, remembering the moment of saving Kuroi, "Isn't this the title I got when I saved that guy?" Having received additional parameters, the boy charged up for new achievements in the battle against the Snow Orc and mentally said, "I did not know that the Apostle of Justice had such an effect. Now I can't blame Kuroi." After these words, Grid got to his feet and received a system notification that said, "All your stats have increased," and Grid happily said in his head, "For all the difficult moments I had experienced." At the same time, somewhere in the Snow Orc camp, one of the pack said something in his language that meant, "Hey, why is he taking so long?" And they answered, "Let's go together. We'll deal with him faster." Just as they were about to leave, their comrade, who had gone to fight Grid, flew right at them. Stepping back so that the body of his comrade did not fall on them, one of the Snow Orcs, not understanding what had happened, nervously exclaimed, "What the hell?" Looking closely at his comrade, who had just come from the snowstorm in which he was fighting the invader, the Snow Orc nervously exclaimed, "He was dead. He had finished off our captain." Hearing this, the other Snow Orcs who were standing nearby were surprised to hear that it was simply impossible. "I don't believe how he managed to do it." After defeating the enemy, Grid received system notifications that said you defeated the enemy and gained experience points. Your level increased. Also, after defeating the enemy, Grid received a system notification that all his health was restored. And seeing this, the boy smiled happily and said, "I grew up after the first kill. It's incredible." Seeing the triumph of the boy who had defeated the commander of their camp, one of the monsters nervously exclaimed that it was simply impossible, to which the other added that he did not understand he was completely unharmed. The next moment, deciding that they would not let this go, all the enemies rushed at Grid, shouting to kill him, "We will all attack together to avenge the captain." Seeing that the enemies themselves began to attack him in such large numbers, Grid joyfully exclaimed, "We need to use this opportunity to increase our level, so come on, get the experience points." Going to meet the enemies, the boy shouted out unbreakable justice. Activating his skill, Grid was able to deal damage equal to his attack power. And now, 3 days have passed since the moment when Grid, excited by the anticipation of battle and leveling up, started farming mobs. At the same time, another traveler appeared in this frosty location who arrived here in Grid's footsteps. Breathing the frosty air, he said, "It's quite cool in the north." This guy turned out to be Kuroi, who came to this location to support Grid, trying to find him in this area. He said thoughtfully, "I wonder if I should have prepared more equipment." Recalling the words of Khan, whom he had asked about Grid's whereabouts, Kuroi recalled how he had told him that he had gone hunting for frost orcs in the mountains to find materials for items. Throwing off his equipment to make it easier, Kuroi immediately fell to his knees and began to beat his head against the frozen ground, nervously saying in his head, "How could I let him go, hunting alone? My deepest apologies, my lord. I will have to punish myself." Having carried out his own punishment for doing this foolishness, Kuroi got to his feet and opened his inventory, looking through the items he had in it. The boy said thoughtfully, "I need to look through the items. I have 50 fire cocktails for the battle against the frost orcs." Immediately after these words, looking at his back, the boy confidently said, "After I receive the class, The partner of the Apostle of Justice also received the opportunity to use a sword and shield that are not available to the speaker. After listing the types of enemies he had available, Kuroi nervously said in his head, "This is all well and good, but will I really be able to resist the frost orcs with it?" Without hesitation, Kuroi, who was more concerned for his master than for his own life, rushed forward and confidently said in his head, "I hope I'm not too late. As the orcs fight in groups, even my master Grid may be in danger." Confidently heading towards his goal, the boy said in his head, "Hold on a little longer, I'm coming to you, Mr. Grid." Heading towards the bright source of light he saw nearby, Kuroi arrived at the enemy camp where he noticed a pile of corpses of enemies, which shocked and disturbed him. Not understanding what could have happened while he was on his way here, the boy nervously asked what the hell was going on. Starting to consider different scenarios, Kuroi mentally said, "I can't be sure that my master remained unharmed after such a battle." Wandering through the village, which was covered with a pile of corpses of enemies, Kuroi suddenly heard someone's moaning voice saying, "Oh, my back." Turning his attention to the source of the sound, the boy noticed Grid nearby and called out his name. Hearing that he was being called by his name, Grid looked in the direction of the voice and saw his friend and said with displeasure that it was "you again, Kuroi." Looking at his master, who looked quite healthy, Kuroi smiled happily and exclaimed in his head that he was fine. He had managed to destroy him with that little dagger. Drilling his eyes into Grid's, Kuroi, who admired his master's strength, added happily, "That's my master's strength." The next moment, as he approached Grid, Kuroi immediately fell to his knees and buried his head in the ground. Seeing this, Grid said, "What are you doing?" To which he replied, "Please forgive me for leaving you, my lord." After Kuroi satisfied himself with his apology to Grid, he tried to ignore the stranger and opened the status window. Looking at his stats and the result of killing so many enemies, Grid happily said in his head, "I managed to get level 83 in a matter of days." Rejoicing at such great results, the guy mentally said, after which his mood went down, "I reached the level I had with the warrior class in 3 days, although those who buy expensive equipment reach the 100th level in a month, so it's quite normal." Immediately after these thoughts, Grid looked back and added in his head, "Though in any case, why does he still continue to follow me?" Looking back and noticing a smile on Kuroi's face, Grid said, "Hey mister, is there anything funny here? Why are you following me with that smile on your face?" Hearing Kuroi's question, he replied confusedly. After a short pause to collect his thoughts, Kuroi added happily, "I'm just very happy. I was so uncomfortable with you walking alone, but now I see that you are doing a great job." Having received a response of inexplicable joy from his pursuer, Grid exhaled heavily and said in his head why he was worried when there was no reason for it. After these thoughts, summarizing the results of his hunt, Grid looked at the total amount of resources received, which consisted of golden skins, frost orc hand axes, orc bows, orc scales, and sulfide scales. Grid said in his head, "I hunted orcs for 3 days and killed about a dozen but got only 3 sulfide scales." Noticing his master, who was in a bad mood for some reason, Kuroi nervously asked, "Why you are frowning so much, my lord?" To which Grid sighed heavily and said in frustration, "It's so annoying." Unable to stand Kuroi's constant whining, Grid looked back and exclaimed angrily, "I am annoyed because I did not get what I wanted, and to top it all off, you still call me my lord every second. Why do you keep following me?" Hearing the reason for his master's bad mood, Kuroi happily said, "You just saved me from that hellish prison cell and pulled me out of a quest that took me hours of real time in the dungeon." Hearing about the hours of continuous quest in the dungeon, Grid said in displeasure that this was nonsense. How could a quest make you spend hours in a dungeon? To which Kuroi said confidently, but it was true. Immediately after these words, Kuroi came closer to Grid and added that the reward for this mission was simply a second class. When Grid heard about the reward for completing this task for hours of real time, He was surprised to hear that the Mongolian who was the first to receive the second class was you, and when he heard this, Kuroi awkwardly replied, "Oh yeah." When Grid received an affirmative answer to his question, he exclaimed angrily that why should you be the only one who received such an award? I also faced a lot of problems saving your life. Feeling Grid's displeasure, Kuroi nervously said, "Please calm down. Despite the fact that he looks quite attractive, this second class is dedicated to serving his master." Gritting his teeth in anger, Grid said in his head, "Sure, the title of Apostle of Justice isn't so bad, but the fact that he got the class at the expense of my efforts is." The next moment, grabbing Kuroi by the collar, Grid angrily shouted to his friend, "Hey, you rascal, listen to me carefully. From now on, you will be obliged to protect me until you die." Hearing this, Kuroi nervously replied, "That's what I told you." Having dealt with all the misunderstandings and the division of responsibilities, Grid, moving ahead, heard from his protector where we were going at the entrance to the camp. There were no more orcs left, to which he replied, "I need 20 sulfide scales." Heading to the cave where the snow trolls were supposed to live, Grid confidently added, "I couldn't collect the amount I needed, so I'll have to enter the camp and kill a few more orcs." Not feeling the danger that was looming over them, Grid added unhappily, "But this 3-day hunt has annoyed me so much that if I don't get a sulfide scale after killing one more orc, I'll just quit the game." After these words, the guys saw a giant monster that appeared out of nowhere, and Grid confusedly added another one. Looking at the giant leader of the Frost Orcs, who was the field boss of the level and came out of the cave with his subjects, Grid paused for a moment and added an orc. While the guys were in shock at what they saw, the field boss decided not to hesitate and immediately launched a counterattack, attacking Grid and Kuroi, but they managed to react and avoid the enemy's attack. Looking back while running away from the giant enemy, Grid nervously exclaimed, "Why the hell did such a monster appear here?" To which Kuroi replied, "Because you destroyed his village. That's all the math." Continuing his escape from the enemy, who clearly had the advantage in this situation, Grid nervously said in his head, "This is pretty bad. He is a level boss, but all is not lost." Immediately after these thoughts, Grid looked back at his subject and shouted, "Hey Kuroi, hold him off so that I can escape from here at that moment." After the order was given, Grid quickly accelerated and headed away from the battlefield while his subject had to distract the enemy, mentally saying, "I did the right thing because his class was sent to help." Sensing this chance for salvation, which he immediately took advantage of, Grid smiled joyfully and said in his head, "I am saved." However, his joy did not last long as he suddenly heard someone else's footsteps near him, and looking in his direction, Grid noticed that Kuroi was running beside him, and he angrily exclaimed, "What the hell are you doing? I am the master. Go and stop him." To which Kuroi replied, "Wait, my lord." After these words, Kuroi confidently added, "You and I don't need to run away. My class is a partner of the Apostle of Justice. If we stay close to each other, our performance will increase by 1. After informing us of this situation, Kuroi also added that I have a level now. So if anything we can fight him off and even defeat him, my level allows us to do so. Hearing about the level of his subject, Grid immediately recalled the moment when Kuroi had covered him with his body and remained completely unharmed. Then he thought it was true. He was strong enough in the dungeon that we had a chance. Agreeing that they might even win this battle, Grid immediately exclaimed to his subject, "Good, then let's do it together, but we'll have to do it together." After a short pause between the words, Grid said in a sly voice, "All the drops we get from this battle will belong to me, since these enemies appeared because of me." Hearing his master's request, Kuroi hesitantly replied, "Of course I agree to this. You are my master, yes." As soon as both players agreed to the terms, Grid created a team, after which a system notification appeared informing both participants that you have created a group. The distribution of items was set to the group leader, and after the group was created, Grid said, "Well, now it's time for us to go." Getting ready to go into battle, Kuroi accidentally noticed that Grid had a system plate that said Grid's group leader level. Realizing that his master had such a low level, Kuroi was confused in his emotions after a few seconds of thought. He exclaimed nervously, intertwined with nervousness, "Wait, Lord Grid, you have only a level. How did you manage to kill orcs with such a level?" Hearing this, Grid asked unhappily that there were problems with my level. Trying to understand where he got such strength to confront enemies with such an advantage in levels, Kuroi exclaimed in surprise, "Lord Grid, are you really one of the 3 owners of the epic class?" Trying to deflect suspicion, Grid replied unhappily, something like that. And hearing this, Kuroi happily exclaimed, "My master is so cool." Having completed the explanation about levels and everything else, Grid confidently said to his friend, "That's enough of this talk. We have work to do." Moving away from Kuroi, leaving him alone with a powerful enemy, Grid exclaimed, "I'm leaving the boss to you and I'll take care of the mobs." Realizing what a mess he had gotten himself into, and that he would now have to deal with the field boss Kuroi, he nervously said in his head, his actions were indeed incredible and truly impossible to predict. Left alone with the giant snow orc boss, Hura took a deep breath to calm himself down and said, "Yes, I need to live up to his expectations." Using the skill of provocation to draw the enemy's attention to himself, Kuroi added confidently in his head to remove the enemy from the battlefield so that he would not interfere and show him his loyalty. When the field boss rushed at Kuroi to finish him off, the boy himself shouted out to his master, "Now, my master." Looking at Kuroi, who was using foul language to draw the enemy's attention to himself, distracting them from the rest of the events that were happening behind them, the family said in surprise, "I have never seen anyone who uses worse language than I do."